I think fundamentally we've got the system that we've collectively decided is what we want because there's been no concrete effort to make meaningful change uh, to change it in any kind of meaningfully consequential way. There's been all kinds of different efforts at streamlining and improvement over the years, but I think most of that has been pretty incremental tinkering on the margins. Hasn't been anything that's been meaningfully transformative. The basic contours and outlines of the system have largely stayed the same. It's been incrementally added to in terms of lots of different parts of process, oversight mechanisms to address past problems, real or perceived. Difference between the two not really mattering all that much. If the people in charge perceive a problem, then whether or not there is one, I think in a lot of ways has been immaterial because they've driven change to reflect what they think is an issue that needs to be mitigated. And we've under-resourced it.
Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, and foreign policy. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. For this week's episode, in anticipation of the forthcoming defense policy update, Dr. David Perry, Ross Fetterly, Charles Davies, Alan Williams, and Dr. Philippe Lagassé provide an overview of SSE and its impact, what to expect in the upcoming defense policy update, and what projects and investments must be prioritized, as well as addressing some of the problems inherent in Canada's defense procurement system. We'll discuss the strong, secure, engaged defense policy, exploring its development, funding, and impact. Then we'll tackle expectations surrounding the impending defense policy update, emphasizing the need for NORAD modernization, NATO commitment, and agile implementation. Then we turn our attention to the persistent challenges plaguing Canada's defense procurement system, highlighting the importance of long-term planning, risk tolerance, and transparency to address these issues effectively. Join us for a comprehensive overview of Canada's defense strategy and the path forward. Interviews for this episode were recorded between May and July of 2023. This is the Expert Series. Our first guest on the program today is Dr. Philippe Lagassé, Associate Professor and the Barton Chair at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. Dr. Lagassé, good to have you on the podcast. Let's get started. How has the strong, secure, and engaged defense policy impacted defense procurement in Canada so far, and what lessons have been learned from its implementation? How will these lessons inform the decision-making process and approach to defense procurement in the future?
So strong, secure, and engaged, SSE, contained a really significant number of initiatives. It represents a major recapitalization of the CAF, and that has been a significant undertaking. In terms of lessons learned and things that will stay, I hope, with defense policy, and I think have proved their merit, the first would be the full integration of the capability-based planning process, and presenting cabinet at the time that SSE was being put together with some different sets of alternatives and different force structures that they could have based on the number of or the amount of funding that they were willing to commit. So that's a good practice going forward, presenting government with different alternatives of what capability sets can look like based on the funding and based on what capabilities-based planning is telling you is within the realm of the possible. Now, I do hope that funding itself will be an important lesson learned. Many still speak of SSE as being fully funded or fully costed, but the problem is that there have been funding shortfalls in important areas. And I hope going forward that even if it sounds properly costed, even if it's assessed independently as SSE was in terms of the costing, that there is a tendency towards a more conservative, and I would dare say even pessimistic approach to costing in the future. Things will always cost more than we anticipate. And as much as there's a desire to go ahead with a policy that sounds like, it's affordable, the fact of the matter is always be prepared for the fact that it's going to cost you more than you anticipate.
What are your thoughts, concerns, and predictions regarding the upcoming defense policy update? Can you provide insights into the specific procurement projects or areas that you think might or should receive increased focus and investment under the upcoming defense policy update, and how might this impact the armed forces capabilities?
So I think the DPU will outline how the government plans to replace equipment that was donated to Ukraine. I also hope that the DPU reflects the lessons from the war in Ukraine in terms of new capabilities and threat assessment and how you meet contemporary threats. As well, I think the big piece that's missing or has been missing both from SSE and NORAD modernization is policy direction when it comes to the acquisition of new submarines. So I think that's the main thing I'll be looking for. Are we going to see in the defense policy update cabinet providing direction to the department and to the CAF to move ahead with the Canadian Patrol Submarine project? What timelines are envisaged for that would also be interesting, and what kind of funding is going to be involved. These are all things that would be interesting to see. Here again, though, my main concern is that the submarine project funding will probably be overly optimistic, and that this may cause delays with the project as it enters options analysis and they begin thinking about how they want to go about acquiring that capability. My main concern would be in two areas. First, the land forces, the Army, and infrastructure. So the Army has a number of projects, many of which look deceptively simple when you just take a quick look at them, but they can become quite complex and quite costly very quickly. Land communications and C4ISR is one, ground-based air defense is another, even utility vehicles are yet another area. So because the Army is composed in terms of its capital program of a number of very set piece projects, a number of them as compared to the big boulders that you see when it comes to the Navy and the Air Force, the Army acquisition capital program becomes quite complicated quite quickly. And if you don't give it the resources and attention it needs, a lot of things can start falling through the cracks. The other one, as I mentioned, is infrastructure, and is probably even the biggest issue for me. There's an understandable focus on equipment and capabilities and people in defense policy, but you can only kind of delay your reinvestment in infrastructure for so long before it becomes a major liability. And I don't think we've devoted enough resources and attention to the overall defense infrastructure portfolio in this country. And I don't know how long we can put that off until it becomes a much more serious problem.
Considering the changes in the geopolitical environment in recent years, what specific areas should the defense policy update focus on to ensure its relevance and effectiveness?
I think the defense policy update has to live within its name. It really needs to be an update. SSE remains fundamentally sound, but there are things that have happened since SSE was released that need to be addressed. I mean, we can already point to NORAD modernization, the war in Ukraine, and the submarine question lingers, as do questions about funding shortfalls. So the DPU has to hold steady, but address known gaps. And I really think that's the key, is that it should be an update as opposed to a major change in direction.
What measures is the government implementing to streamline the defense procurement process and reduce bureaucratic red tape to ensure more timely delivery of equipment and systems to the CAF?
There's been a good deal of attention towards more agile procurement, particularly for systems that involve rapid technological change, such as IT or drone systems or whatever it is. And while work is ongoing on that front, it still presents a challenge, and I'm not sure there's enough attention being paid to ensuring that Treasury Board and the Department of National Defense are on the same page when it comes to making agility happen. So that remains a challenge. Overall, though, when it comes to streamlining and removing red tape, it's important to recognize that with major change comes risk. And this is, we tend to be fairly risk averse in this country when it comes to the expenditure of public funds. Therefore, that becomes an underlying problem. How much risk are we willing to tolerate? And generally speaking, one of the main impediments, I would say, towards faster procurement or more streamlined procurement is, what is our risk tolerance level? And I would argue that our risk tolerance level is still fairly low.
What will it take for Canada to address the challenges inherent in its procurement system? Maybe perhaps specifically risk averseness.
There's no simple procedural fix for Canada's procurement system. But ultimately, I would say it comes down to three things. As I said, the first, greater acceptance of risk and a higher tolerance of error. So if we want procurement to move faster, we need to provide project teams with greater autonomy while recognizing that this will result in mistakes sometimes. If we remain determined to avoid mistakes, to avoid risk, then we'll be stuck with the slower system that we have, because that's what we're favoring. We're favoring greater control, less autonomy in order to achieve, or in order to reduce risk. So we have to recognize that's an important trade-off that we face. Second, we need to be, as I mentioned, more pessimistic about costing and nimbler when it comes to the mechanisms that we have in place to reallocate funds when priority projects need more money. So the funding problems overall can slow down many projects, despite the policy direction that they enjoy. So despite the fact that the government has said a capability is required, if there isn't sufficient funding allocated to that project, it can impede it, or you end up delivering a capability that's not on par with what you think you should be getting. And we need better systems in place in order to allocate funds quickly to projects that are a priority and need them. And that remains a bit of a stumbling block, because that involves reallocating significant amount of money across projects, which is not an easy feat. And finally, I would say the system needs to be far more transparent. The more D&D puts into the public domain, the less controversy, scandal, and concern there will be. And this may seem counterintuitive, but it does work. Problems and delays become boring process stories when the department provides detailed explanations of what's actually going on. Problems and delays become controversy and scandal when there's a perception that things are being hidden or concealed, or that they don't want to talk about it. The way to make these issues less controversial is by effectively providing more information. And that is something that we're still struggling with. I think touching on this last point of transparency, I do think there's ways of making this part of an overall effort to increase transparency within the national security community in Canada. And I really do hope this is an opportunity that we can seize. And perhaps one last one is just to make the point that providing parliamentary committees with more access to detailed information about where the procurement system is overall, where the capital program is overall, would be a good step forward, particularly as we seem to be in an era of minority parliaments. And the best way to get different parties on board is to try and be more frank with them about where the capital program is, what programs are struggling, and what measures are being taken in order to address that.
Dr. Lagassé, always a pleasure. Thank you for joining me today. Next up, we'll be speaking with Alan Williams, Associate and Senior Advisor with David Pratt & Associates and former Assistant Deputy Minister for Materiel for DND. Mr. Williams, nice to have you on the program, and thanks for joining me today. Why don't we dive right in? So considering all the changes in the geopolitical environment over the past 5 years or so, what specific areas should the defense policy update focus on to ensure its relevance and effectiveness?
It's a great question. I don't think anyone would deny that there's a need for a policy update. The world seems to me to be a lot more dangerous and unpredictable than it ever has been. You just have to witness the Wagner insurrection or mutiny this past weekend. I think everybody was shocked by that. Having said that, I think the most fundamental thing for the new policy update would be to ensure that whatever policy does resonate and is developed is implementable. The previous one, Strong, Secure, and Engage, had no chance of ever being able to be implemented.
Perhaps you could build on that comment that it never had any chance of being implemented. What exactly do you mean by this?
Well, if you're going to have a policy, you have to make sure it's properly resourced, and you have to make sure that it has the appropriate decision-making processes and accountabilities to ensure that decisions get made nimbly and quickly with agility, and that someone's held accountable. None of that was adequately built in to the previous policy. And that's why, frankly, we're in the chaos we are today. The two major programs that have just been decided upon, that are being decided upon, building the Canadian Surface Combatant ships and the acquisition of our new jets, the capital costs of those two programs alone exceed the available capital budget by $5 billion. And that's just for those two. You can forget about enhanced space surveillance. You can forget about the NORAD modernization or replacing our maritime patrol planes, submarines. None of that is doable. And so you have that kind of resource chaos that clearly was not built in to support the previous SSE plan. You also can look at decision making. The shipbuilding program was decided in 2010. We're expecting our first CSC ships 20 years later. I mean, is that nimble decision making and processing, or is it not? So that kind of chaos can't be accepted, and those limitations have to be addressed no matter what policy you're going to put forward. Make sure decision making accountabilities are clear, and make sure it's properly resourced.
What changes can be made to the defense procurement process to yield immediate and dramatic improvements? And how can the process be streamlined and accountability strengthened?
Well, I have to tell you, I'm like a broken record on this. I've been talking about this for 20 years. We're the only country in the Western world that doesn't have one minister accountable. I mean, I think that's irrational, and you pay a price for that. It doesn't mean that you have one minister accountable, all problems are solved. But if you don't have someone in charge, if you have two ministers overlapping, no one's in charge. And if no one's in charge, performance suffers. I remember reading Peter Drucker, management guru, once said that if you have any government, be it for a company or for a country, it degenerates into mediocrity and malperformance if, in fact, there's no one accountable for results. And with two ministers, you have no minister accountable, and no one is accountable for results. We don't have any performance measures. You know, we don't measure the timeliness and costs of the different programs. If you don't know where the problems lie because you don't have performance measures, you can't fix them. And so don't expect improved performance. Also, you know that if you don't have one person accountable, the rigor is not there. I always use the example that when if I asked my children to do the dishes, and none of them would do it. If I specified one of them, and then maybe that child would do it, and more often they would. You can't be vague, you can't be general if you want results. And the other big advantage of doing this is that, of course, if you have a streamlined operation, 1 minister instead of two, you save a lot of resources. The overlap and duplication of resources is significant. And at a time when national defense is suffering from lack of resources, in the 10,000s or so people have talked about, this could go a long way to helping that. The other thing I would focus attention on, and I alluded to it a little bit when I talked about the lack of proper costing in the defense policy. What is needed is a 30-year defense capital plan. People don't realize that the capital plan, when you budget for capital acquisition, the cost to buy something is only about 30% of the total cost. 70% of the cost is due to maintain it, support it, and operate it. And so if you want to have a defense policy that is doable, and you want to monitor that and make sure it's on a solid foundation, then you have to have a 30-year plan that maps out all of the capital requirements that are needed to support the policy, including their acquisition costs and their life cycle maintenance and operational costs. And you map that against the available capital and maintenance budgets that are available year by year over 30 years. And you make sure that there is sufficient funding to get the job done. If there isn't, then you have to go back to the policy and say, you either have to lower the expectations from the military in terms of their role and mandate, or you have to provide more money. But you can't keep the policy in a state where it doesn't balance with the resourcing. And so you need a kind of fiscal rigor to really be sure that everything you say you need to support a policy is in fact budgeted for, which we do not have now.
How could the public perhaps play a more active role in the defense procurement process and ensure that they're contributing to informed decision making?
Well, I think you have to ask yourself, why hasn't the government taken the step? I know I've been an advocate for it over 20 years. The Canadian Association for Defense and Security Industries, CADSI, put out a report, I think in 2009, advocating one minister. Even the current Prime Minister, in mandate letters in 2019, I believe, asked his two ministers of these two departments, National Defense and Public Service and Procurement Canada, to combine themselves, but never happened. And you have to ask yourself, why not? And part of the reason gets to your point. I'm not sure the public is all that seized with this. I'm not sure that making this business more efficient and effective is where government sees themselves gaining votes. And so they'd rather put their emphasis on different syllables, I like to say. They hear what Canadians are saying. Canadians aren't talking much about defense, or have not been. And so they say, okay, they're more concerned about their economy and jobs. That's where I'll focus my attention. I don't think it's acceptable. I think the government should be leading. We have men and women that are giving their lives for this country. They deserve an organization that is agile, quick, and efficient, that gets them what they need when they need it, with the right resourcing. And the government, I think, should take this step and create one organization. There's also, the reason why I think this also hasn't happened is it can be perceived that it's a win-lose. Some minister is going to lose some authority. I mean, the business of defense, if it gets taken away from the PSPC minister, boy, that's a big loss. And I understand that kind of emotional attachment to this. And that's why I said, probably, if you're going to do it, you have to do it during an election campaign where you're about to change ministers anyway, so no one minister can be seen as being a loser. And it has to be directed by the Prime Minister, otherwise it'll never happen. But Canadians have to be more concerned about defense. I think the chaos in the world right now is hopefully making them more aware that you can't just depend on our neighbors to the south. We have to take advantage ourselves. Also, I noticed that I think this past weekend, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Monique Joly, was talking about having more of an impact in the world. And she was saying that she needs to make sure that her ambassadors are more up to date, more updated with the information. But I would say to her, that's not going to generate more influence. What generates influence in the world is money. If you want to have an impact, you have to put your money where your mouth is. You have to walk the talk. And what you have to do is provide the resources to show that Canada is doing its share in NATO and around the world by committing funds, not simply talking. We have a marvelous military. I know when I joined the department, I was just, was an honor to be part of it. And the more I got to hear from and learn from the military men and women and the civilians, the military that are out there in theater giving their lives, the more impressed I am. And frankly, I'm frustrated and disappointed and angry that we can't seem to do right by them. There's no limitation as to what we can do. If we really commit to providing them with the resources they need and giving them decision-making processes that aren't laden with panels and committees and all these kinds of bureaucratic processes that slow things down. If we can get rid of these things, hold someone accountable, drive for performance and results, we can really do right by them.
Alan, thanks for joining me. Now we'll turn to Dr. Ross Fetterly, former Royal Canadian Air Force Director of Air Controllership and Business Management and Military Personnel Command Comptroller. Fetterly also held other senior positions with the Department of National Defense, Assistant Deputy Minister of Finance. Dr. Fetterly, good to have you on. Considering the changes in the geopolitical environment over the past 5 years, what specific areas should the upcoming defense policy update focus on to ensure its relevance and effectiveness? And how could it improve upon the current defense policy?
The history of the Canadian military is fighting on foreign wars. And this benefit we have of 3 oceans that separate us from potential opponents means that we have to be coordinating with other countries for our procurement, such as some of our European partners, but primarily with the Americans, and then do training and exercises with them as the Canadian military does on a regular basis. China has built a navy that is right now the largest in the world in terms of numbers of ships. So certainly the Pacific coast will probably be of greater interest, and we'll probably see that will require more infrastructure on the west coast and even up in the Arctic to support Canadian sovereignty. Canada needs to recruit, train, and have operational ready troops. You know, we have currently in Canada over 10,000 vacant positions. People, you know, from teaching on some RMC courses, you know, some of my students, you know, are planning to leave the military for other activities, other work. So, you know, that is a big issue that I think is it's people. You need people to move programs, and if we don't have the people, they won't. You know, you need, for example, on a new aircraft that is being purchased, you need pilots, you need maintainers, you need procurement people, all military, along with public servants to run a large capital equipment program.
What would you say are some of the key lessons learned from past defense procurement projects or challenges, and how might they inform future policy and decision-making processes?
One thing that would be helpful is bipartisan support. When you have Parliamentary Committee on Defense and others, where you have the three major parties that are all members, you know, that is a good forum to look at, you know, what kind of equipment do we need, and from a political perspective, where are we going to buy it, and that sort of thing. So that would help also getting the funding. And the United States is much better than we are in consistently funding their defense and having more in terms of their budgeting process going out 10 years or so to really plan for it. So that allows the administration of capital equipment projects, force growth in terms of people and that sort of thing to happen on a more planned process than when we were in the middle of the war in Afghanistan. And I was involved in costing at the department, and we costed for the federal government what it would cost to increase the Canadian forces by 5,000 people, which they agreed to, and then we surged training and moved forward. But those are the types of things that can be done with bipartisan support.
How would you say that the evolving or perhaps even deteriorating international strategic environment has challenged or changed Canada's traditional approach to defense and security?
We need more money. What is unfortunate is the percentage of GDP that we're spending on defense is 1.32%. The NATO standard is 2%. Other countries that were below that, particularly Europe, which are closer to where the conflict in Ukraine is happening, you know, they've already increased their spending because of the closeness of this conflict and the way Russia is behaving. So increasing to 2% of GDP is something that Canada needs to do in order to match and show that we're aligned and support our allies. And it sends a signal to our allies, if we don't increase our defense spending, that we're really not serious in a more contentious world of investing in defense. So D&D continues to underspend compared to SSE projections. Second, delays are pushing planned SSE spending further into the future. And this also will increase when we actually get to that spending project. The costs will have increased. So that will bring more money out of the budget. And as I said near the beginning, shortfalls of military personnel and D&D personnel impacts on the ability of defense to work on capital equipment programs. You know, SSE provides a lot of people, which we fund for, and other departments. We need to have the money to fund those to get our projects. Can I just do a couple of quick points? The first is defense-specific inflation. Because of the high technology level within defense, that's why one reason why defense weapon systems, because they're high technology, are very expensive. So this actually gets us less than if we were buying things from the and also the budget, the funding increases in budget 2022 allocated over $8 billion over 5 years to bolster the capacity of the Canadian forces. We're going to need a lot more money now as the strategic environment has changed.
Thanks for joining us, Dr. Fetterly. It's been a pleasure. Now we turn to Dr. David Perry, President of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and host of the weekly Defense Deconstructed podcast. Dave, thanks for accepting the CDA Institute's invitation to partake in the expert series. Great having you on. We have quite a bit of ground to cover, so maybe we can start with a scene setter. How has SSE impacted defense procurement in Canada, and what lessons have been learned from its implementation?
So I think it impacted procurement significantly in a couple senses. It took a procurement system that was already pretty supercharged with the amount of money and the amount of demand in terms of projects, big projects, the amount of money that had been already in the system as a legacy of the previous Harper government's attempts to recapitalize, reinvest in the military, which were building on the Martin government's attempts to recapitalize, reinvest, all of which were following on about a decade and a half of really low underinvestment in capital equipment purchases in particular. And then Strong Secure Engaged came in pledging to add tens of billions of dollars more capital investment, and to do that with a very quick ramp up period. Lots of folks had focused on the length of the tail and how back end loaded the policy was, but I actually was struck by how aggressive it was and its planned increased spending in the early years, which I think has basically proven to have been far too ambitious from the beginning. I think the biggest takeaway should be that we do not, at our peril, spend nearly enough time focused on implementation, and that it's one thing to go secure authorities, secure the policy approval, get money, actually moving it and implementing it, spending the money, getting to contract, moving paper through all the different parts of the procurement system is hugely problematic. Whatever you think about our system, I think it at a minimum is not calibrated adequately with the demand we're putting on it. So we've got more ambition than we can execute in the time frame, and there wasn't, I don't think, enough recognition of that at the outset about what would actually need to be done to implement it. There were a number of initiatives that, in Strong Secure Engaged around procurement streamlining. Those were all good things. I noted at the time that a lot of them were at least 5 years old at that point and hadn't actually been implemented. And pace of implementation of some of those, some of which I'm not actually sure whether or not they're ever finished or not. And nobody seems to want to talk about them anymore, which would kind of suggest that they didn't really go anywhere. But they were all relatively incremental. And you were talking about having a pretty significant increase, like 3-4-fold increase in terms of the amount of money spent within just a couple of years, which is a pretty significant change. So I think the lesson from that is that you got to be realistic about implementation, need to be realistic about timeframes, and actually trying to baseline expectations for what you're going to do moving forward with a reasonable understanding of what is possible with this system that you've got at the moment, if you're not planning for consequential change quickly. And we tend to have a habit of going for incremental change slowly. And if you're going to do that, then you can't expect the output to rise dramatically.
What were the key elements and considerations that shaped Canada's strong, secure, engaged national defense policy, and what was the policy-making process behind it? Furthermore, what are some of the fundamental developments that have occurred since the inception of SSE?
So I think some of the kind of the context, the Liberal Party had pledged to do a defense policy review in its campaign platform, which had included almost everything under the sun, including a couple of kitchen sinks. There was hundreds of campaign commitments in there, but on defense, they were pretty, I think, oriented around that. So there was some, I think, at least enthusiasm at the political level for doing that, and a pretty strong commitment to do a review, make it public, do a lot of consultation, all of which happened. It also then ended up in practical terms occurring against the backdrop of the NAFTA negotiations, which I think put a lot finer point on what came through that, because it happened against the backdrop of a Trump administration being much more focused on being transactional and calling us out much more explicitly about where we stood in terms of what we were spending on defense. And I think it's probably no coincidence that the campaign commitment to do a review, but to keep basically the spending trajectory constant with the predecessor Harper government, evolved to a multi-tens of billions of dollar increase. There was no accident that happened against the backdrop of the NAFTA negotiations. And I think we've seen in Canada successive policy documents and reviews have basically not made enormous changes in terms of, broadly speaking, what we're looking to do in terms of actually delivering policy outcomes. Same broad mission set, roles to the forces. You see a bunch of tinkering around kind of the specific force structure, but really not a ton of evolution in my observation. But really it's a question about how large a check governments are willing to write, and then what that allows to get done. So whether or not you're going to do a scaled down replacement of fleets, like in the Navy's case as an example, or whether or not there's the money being provided to do a larger, more fulsome one. On fighter jets, we went from we ended up through a whole bunch of trials and tribulations, basically committing to an expanded fleet of our tactical fighters when we actually get around to getting them. So I think there was an increased level of ambition in some cases. It was also happening against a backdrop of, at least in the early years of the Trudeau government, a lot of enthusiasm about deliverology and ostensibly focusing on implementation, which seemed to basically dematerialize after a couple of years. So there's a bit of an irony there. I think one of the other big focuses at the time, which didn't, I think, hold up all that well over time for a couple of reasons, but a lot of focus about trying to be more rigorous about costing and funding. I think it was probably the best costed and most calibrated funding decision. I don't think that necessarily means fully funded or best funded, but there was a stronger effort to be more rigorous about some of the costing elements that went into the policy document, and try and be more deliberate, I think, and more precise about linking money with specific outcomes, and being more conscious and rigorous about doing that. At the end of the day, though, that all got vastly overstated, and I think it had been clung to for far too long, and some people still do, to say that that policy was fully funded and fully costed. It may have been fully costed, but a lot of, certainly on the procurement side, a whole bunch of those projects were basically an identification or early options analysis, which meant that it was way too early to have any realistic expectation of having a lot of fidelity on what those things were going to cost. And there also hadn't been very rigorous work done about implementation, which meant that you couldn't calibrate accurately or plan with a much degree of certainty about when you would actually be moving them forward. And all that meant that the project budgets got out of sync just in terms of a time phasing. And that left a number of different issues in terms of the affordability of different project budgets, even prior to the last, call it 18 months, where we've seen inflation in the consumer economy go bananas, supply chains get totally disrupted, and then the largest land war on the planet at a conventional scale in Ukraine totally turned a whole chunk of the international defense industrial base market upside down. And I think that all of that has really undermine most of the finance into the whatever the next update to that policy is. Somebody's going to have to deal with a whole bunch of legacy holdover affordability issues and deal with the mismatch between ambition and underpinning financial support.
What are your thoughts, concerns, and predictions regarding the upcoming defense policy update?
So if you look at what the Liberal Party in power since 2015 has done so far, both with Strong, Secure, Engaged, and then the NORAD modernization announcement, as well as some other pieces in the budget in 2022, and some maneuvers it made to kind of accounting room to allow for additional investment kind of within the existing financial framework through some of their fall updates. I would predict that if there is a review that comes to fruition, I'm not 100% convinced that there will be one, because if it didn't come out for the NATO summit, then I'm not 100% convinced what the driver is going to be to get it released. But if there is one, I would predict that it's going to provide what is ostensibly a huge amount of money, but an amount that would fall very well short of the aspirations and expectations for the Department of National Defense, who will probably have its hopes and dreams crushed. And I think to expand on that, I mean, I'd also say that I don't yet remain convinced that enough time is going to have gone into focusing on its implementation. I think that still remains a big weakness of our system. We're a lot more oriented around securing approval for new things and not enough oriented around focusing on delivering what we have in the here and now. I think the other thing, just to kind of build off what I was saying before about having to deal with those, financial pressures, I don't yet think that the government of Canada writ large, nor the Department of National Defense, has come to grips with the current inflationary environment that we live in now. We have a whole accounting regime set up around procurement that allows money to be reprofiled into the future. It sort of addressed an explicit use it or lose it dynamic that we used to have historically, which incidentally also provided more of a forcing function, I think, because you had to use it or you lost it. But now the current accrual accounting system, the capital investment fund framework that we have allows money to be reprofiled from one year to the next without ostensibly a huge amount of trouble. Up until a year and a half ago, all kinds of that had happened, but all of it had happened under an environment of historically rock bottom interest rates and cost of financing, which are now, those have now returned to kind of more historically normal rates. And so the impact of lost purchasing power now is dramatically different than it had been up until early part of 2022. And I don't think we've really come to grips with that. So the previous flexibility / option of reprofiling money indefinitely is going to be a lot more consequential now that the Bank of Canada's rate's gone to 5% for the first time in a generation. And I don't know that we've come to grips with the impact of not being able to move and spend money on schedule yet.
Considering the changes in the geopolitical environment over the past 5 years, what specific areas should the update of the defense policy focus on to ensure its relevance and effectiveness? And what recommendations might you have?
I think one of the takeaways for me from the war in Ukraine is that we need to have more of a focus on what we can do in the next, say, 5 years. It's great to have aspirations and it's necessary to plan out over a longer time horizon, but I think in some cases we have a tendency in Canada to do that at the expense of actually implementing what's actually real in the near term. And by real, I mean we don't spend enough time focusing on actually spending money that has already been policy approved, for which people have already got money in the bank and secured authorities to spend, and we don't spend enough time on actually executing that, because that's really the meaningful route to getting capability in hand within a 5-year period. Any project that is introduced new in the defense policy update, if it comes to fruition, I wouldn't expect to turn into fieldable operational military capability inside 15 years if we're lucky, other than by a few exceptions. And more realistically, be looking at a 20-year into the future time horizon for actually getting operational capability. That's been our track record for big systems, and that's without factoring in all the personnel limitations in the Canadian military right now, shortages of people across the board, including incidentally in most of the parts of the organization that need to be engaged to actually do procurement, to move forward on the military side, the force development aspects, all that kind of stuff. So I think we've also seen that there are other countries, peer competitors, adversaries, whatever you want to call them, that have had taken different approaches to their ability to be ready for conflict right now. It's been interesting watching over the last 500 days, people mocking the amount, the age and state of the equipment the Russians are pulling out of deep storage, but they've pulled out sequentially 40 or 50-year-old tanks that exist in numbers that are 4 or 5 times larger than most NATO countries have in their entire holdings, and they're, obviously they're not as modern and not as capable, but there's I think a definite quality to having quantity which we lack entirely, that has been exposed here. So getting our heads around the idea of it's important to actually have a bunch of capability today and more depth to it. We've also shown, not just in Canada, but especially in Canada, that we really have very little depth in a lot of different ways. We've now we had this whole discussion about how many tanks we were able to send to Ukraine, and one of the fundamental limits on that was we only had 80 to start with. And if you have 80 instead of a couple of hundred or more than that, then your ability to deploy any of them is obviously going to be a lot less. And we don't have much in the way of holdings of ammunition for war stocks. I don't think our spare parts inventories are very deep. So our ability to actually engage and sustain in conflict is pretty limited. And I think that made a lot of sense during past eras of conflict that we're looking at: asymmetric fighting, counterinsurgency, peacekeeping. You didn't need to have much in the way of artillery ammunition on reserve. I think we should have learned in the last 500 days that you need to have a lot more of that on hand, and also have a much better ability to actually mobilize for a larger scale conflict. So strong, secure, engaged spent a lot of time talking about, return to great power competition, which I think in essence means return to having to think about conventional conflict in a peer on peer, near peer, whatever you want to call it, kind of dynamic. And that looks more like Ukraine, where you've got a combination of all the kind of fancy new toys, better connectivity, digitization, drones, all that kind of stuff, with World War I scale levels of artillery usage. And even if we think that we're, going to be needing maybe half or a quarter or a third or whatever the right number is, the volume of those kinds of fires, because we use more precision rather than mass, I think we are still dramatically underinvesting in the kind of depth you need to do that. And I also think, unfortunately, in the last 500 days, we've shown that we seem to have totally lost the muscle memory on how to actually go and engage and mobilize the defense industrial base to support that. Still haven't seen any effort in this country to ramp up and engage the defense industry to either support Ukraine on a systemic basis. We've provided a lot of money to buy things kind of on 6-month cycles, but no effort to engage in any kind of longer term ramp up to support Ukraine in the short term or the medium term, because I think it's increasingly clear that this conflict's not going to be wrapped up by the end of the calendar year. So they're going to need support to keep going. And I would point to the cluster munitions decision, which I don't think the US government was tremendously thrilled about making, but we've demonstrated collectively that we don't have the capacity to keep supplying that level and type of conflict for as long as proven necessary. And at least in Canada, we haven't actually moved to engage that, just pull up some of our own domestic manufacturing. We've seen that in the US. The European Union has actually come forward with some plans to do that. There's some mention about that at the most recent NATO summit, but still waiting to see some of that here. And certainly, after multiple decades of calibrating our force structure, our equipment holdings, all the kind of strategic sustainment behind that against low intensity conflict. There's a big effort to reorient around a much higher level of intensity of fighting, at least potentially, and be prepared for that in a way that I think we've demonstrated we clearly have not been. And I don't know that we've really meaningfully moved towards it.
To your knowledge, what specific measures is the government implementing to streamline the defense procurement process?
I think we could burn through whatever amount of time you have notionally remaining with me answering that. I think fundamentally we've got the system that we've collectively decided is what we want, because there's been no concrete effort to make meaningful change to change it in any kind of meaningfully consequential way. There's been all kinds of different efforts at streamlining and improvement over the years, but I think most of that has been pretty incremental tinkering on the margins. Hasn't been anything that's been meaningfully transformative. The basic contours and outlines of the system have largely stayed the same. It's been incrementally added to in terms of lots of different parts of process, oversight mechanisms to address past problems, real or perceived. Difference between the two not really mattering all that much. If the people in charge perceive a problem, then whether or not there is one, I think in a lot of ways has been immaterial, because they've driven change to reflect what they think is an issue that needs to be mitigated. And we've under-resourced it. I'd point to the example of the passport office that lots of Canadians would be familiar with the last year and a bit. We had a massive issue about working through a backlog of passport applications that was affecting people in a tangible way, and the timelines had become insane. And there were over 1,500, I think, additional staff put against that problem. And when I looked at the data, there was basically like roughly speaking, like a twofold increase in demand over historical expectation for passport usage, and the staffing was increased by 1,500 people. Strong, Secure, and Engage came in. The expectation was that our procurement system was going to spend between 3 and 4 times more money within 4 years. And as best as I can tell, maybe 300 additional people have been added to the material group, which is about an 10-11% increase, something like that. A couple of years ago, Public Services and Procurement Canada had some money to add additional staff. Which, hopefully if you added everybody up together, they could form their own softball team. And so the expectation that without making big systemic changes to do consequential streamlining of that process in a way that removed big chunks of steps, if you're just going to add, a couple of percentage points worth of additional staff and not change anything else, then you shouldn't really be surprised that you can't ramp up and spend 3 to 4 times more money and move that many more big projects that more quickly. And there's been lots of other efforts by the government to try and do other things socioeconomically, that whatever you think about the objectives of those, they are government policy, and it's required to deliver on them through defense and other forms of government procurement, but all of which require capacity and bandwidth and resourcing to execute on. So as we're looking forward, unless the defense update proposes consequential increases in capacity or consequential change in terms of the process in the system to remove steps and have meaningful reductions in time involved in different parts of it, then should expect it to only be able to move incrementally more money, incrementally more projects than before. I think we're kind of at the point where we can keep doing the incremental progressive change, or do some consequential, meaningful rethink, which would have to be some combination of consequential process change and consequential increase in capacity. Otherwise, we're going to keep under delivering the amount of money that's actually been provided, and we're going to take multiple decades instead of 1 or 1.5 to deliver major capabilities.
Dave, thanks once again for joining me. Great to have you on. To close out this episode, we'll turn to Colonel Chuck Davies, CDAI Fellow and former Canadian Armed Forces Logistics Officer and public servant. Chuck held a number of senior positions in the Department of National Defense, including 4 years as the Strategic Planning Director for the Materiel Group, and 3 years as the Senior Director responsible for material acquisition and support policy across the department. Chuck, great to see you again, and thanks for being on the program. How would you say Strong, Secure, Engaged has impacted defense procurement in Canada, if at all? And could you describe a few lessons that have been learned from its implementation, and how could it inform the decision-making process going further?
So I think there's certainly some of the commentary suggests that there's some misunderstanding of what the defense policy is and what SSE was. So SSE was intended to provide the government's assessments of the nation's defense needs and to lay out its plans for keeping the associated CAF capabilities current and capable of doing the mission. And that included providing cost estimates for the investments that were going to be required and allocating the funds to make those investments. The fact that those cost estimates go up from time to time has suggested to some people that the policy was underfunded from the outset and was therefore some sort of a failure or less than excellent product. I don't agree with that. Cost estimates are point-in-time estimates. They're just that, they're estimates. And they are all based on certain assumptions. And those assumptions will change, the estimates will change as work is done to fill in the unknowns and to modify and drive down risks. And as basic commodity and labor prices and everything else change over time, usually upwards, of course. So governments in that context have to decide periodically, do I constrain what I'm asking the project to deliver to the budget, to some sort of an envelope, or do I say I need this level of capability and I'll have to fund it to that level? And that's no different from, say, if I were building a home and I hadn't yet bought the lot and I hadn't yet finalized the design, and you go through stages of understanding what the cost drivers are going to be, and you go through the process of deciding how much money you're going to put into getting that home built the way you want, or what compromises you're going to have to make in order to keep within what you think you can afford or want to spend. So it's no different in government going through decisions around defense procurements in these complex programs. And I point out last year's inquiry, certainly of interest to those of us here in Ottawa, into the Ottawa LRT light rail system political boondoggle, the previous council's management of that implementation of that project. And one of the things that the inquiry clearly pointed out was the folly of turning initial estimates into a politically sacrosanct budget cap. They've had to make some pretty serious trade-offs in order to keep within that politically mandated cap, and that caused all kinds of problems as they tried to bring the system online. So in that context, I think SSE was actually successful, and it gave DND and the other government departments involved in executing the various programs involved the marching orders. Said, you're going, take the hill, this is, and everybody's going to pull in that direction. And that really smoothed out the process within government of getting all the players to move in the same direction at the same time and deliver results. Was it perfect? And the whole process never perfect, but without the policy, DND faces enormous obstacles in trying to move program forward and get decisions from government. What happens after a few years is that policy direction gets stale dated. So this is why the SSE update is going to be important, because the DND will get a renewed, and all the other departments will get a renewed mandate to move to the next bound. I think that's really important. Where I will agree with the critics of SSE is that it largely failed to support its aspirations for, again, improving defense procurement. Every government that's ever come into power has promised to improve defense procurement, but it didn't back any of those aspirations up with concrete measures that would have actually accomplished that. There were some small successes. So DND did get a bump up in its own procurement authorities or contracting authorities up to $5 million. So that cleared a bunch of clag out of the interdepartmental schmozzle around procurement. But inflation has been eating away over the last few years over the value of that. I also think that D&D was successful. They got additional funding to and further strengthen their own in-house capabilities. Not so sure about other departments having been that successful either. There was no visible sign, though. There's been no visible sign since 2017 when the SSE came out of any improvement in the departmental machinery of government for moving those big procurement projects forward. I haven't seen anything beyond what had already been delivered under the Harper government's defense procurement strategy, which the Trudeau government has continued with. So what lessons the government should draw from that or might draw from that, I don't know. Based on history, I have fairly low expectations. But SSC, I look to SSP to perhaps contain some further adjustments to process, probably more peripherally around the edges, but some is better than none. However, you know, absent something more fundamental, and maybe we can talk about that a little later in the discussion. You know, I don't see much scope for SSC to make really radical improvements in the defense procurement business. The government came into power with a certain view of the world, and that was reflected in SSC. So we had seen the annexation of Crimea. We had seen Russia becoming much more aggressive in its neighborhood. China had been a little bit belligerent, but the government fundamentally didn't see China as a problem. It saw it more as an opportunity. And after SSE came out, sort of they had the rose-colored glasses ripped off their faces, like every other Western government, like Germany, like many other countries. When the Russians invaded Ukraine, and earlier during the Two Michaels confrontation with China, that there's a fundamental rethink. Those were what we would call strategic shock events that forced countries and groups of countries to fundamentally rethink their foreign policy, their defense requirements, and so on. And those things have happened since the publication of SSE. So I would be expecting to see some pretty fundamental recasting of the government's perspective of the global environment in this update. And if that's not there, then the document is a joke. But I'm sure it will be there. Minister Freeland has always had a fairly robust view of the value of sort of the hard power capabilities of the nation. And she is still obviously influential in cabinet. I think Minister Joly is more in that direction than some other elements of the government may still be. I'm not sure where the Prime Minister is. My sense has always been that he's more comfortable in the soft power realm, but I think he's a pragmatist and he sees that you know, the world is what it is, not what one might like it to be.
Now that we've talked a little bit about SSE, what are some of your thoughts, concerns, or questions regarding what's in the upcoming defense policy update? We've already discussed it a little bit, but perhaps you could elaborate more on what might be in there.
Sure. So the first thing I'm going to be looking for is whether the government has done any more comprehensive thinking about the international environment that I just spoke about, and more particularly about the government of Canada's international engagement strategies that it should be following. So as I mentioned, that SSE, SSE did contain some policy, some foreign policy context, but it looked to be an afterthought. Minister Freeland had a piece, a letter or message at the front end of the document, along with Minister Sajjan. And she stood up in Parliament a couple of days before SSE was released and presented a fairly comprehensive, I would call landmark foreign policy speech in Parliament, which was very unusual. Unfortunately, it wasn't accompanied by a foreign policy statement of some kind, foreign policy document to align with SSE, but the messaging was consistent among them. But defense policy and foreign policy need to be integrated between them, and they also need to be integrated with other policies like international trade, international development, and so on, for you to have a comprehensive and coherent government strategy around how you're going to engage in the world. The only policy suite that I recall having seen over the years that nature was Paul Martin's in 2005, accompanied by a 2004 national security policy statement, which is the first and only national security policy that any Canadian government has ever produced. So that's the first thing I'll be looking for, is some sense that the government is thinking more broadly about how it approaches the world. Second thing I want to look for is whether the Ukraine war, China's increasing belligerence that we talked about, and the continuous pressure that the government has been receiving from its allies, particularly the NATO allies, see whether that has moved their yardstick, or you move the needle for them in terms of their moving the country, getting the country closer towards the 2% GDP spending target. I'm not holding my breath, and I don't think they move very far, but they might move some. Third thing I'm looking for is a clear path towards accelerated acquisition of a new submarine fleet, because planning for the replacement of the aging Victoria class, which were used boats when we bought them, is very, very late to need. It was something I criticized SSE for when it came out. It's not having a plan. They had some midlife updates for the Victoria class mentioned in it, but there was no mention of planning to starting to plan for replacement, and that's when it should have started. So they're it's about 6 years late in getting the thing moving, but there have been signs that that's happening or starting to happen. And I'll expect to see some movement in that direction. So those are the three sort of big movers that I'm looking for in SSE. There will undoubtedly be a range of other things as well, but those are the three big kickers.
So you've described things you're expecting in the defense policy update, the essentials. I'm wondering if you might be able to provide insight into any specific procurement areas or projects that you think might or should receive increased focus and investment with the upcoming defense policy update.
So I've already mentioned the submarine replacement. I think that's the most urgent, and it's a big ticket item that needs to be moving. The government's also already signaled movement on Aurora replacement. There's a little bit of controversy about whether they should buy a Bombardier aircraft or a Boeing aircraft, but that project is already in progress clearly, and upgrade of NORAD. So, and finally, it's also remained solid in terms of the 15-ship Canadian Surface Combatant Fleet. So, alongside the F-35 program, which is in implementation now, those programs will collectively rebuild over time the CAF's most critical capabilities to fulfill one of the two big no-fail tasks for any Canadian government, and that is surveillance and defense of Canada's maritime and air approaches, which are also largely our U.S. neighbors' maritime and air approaches. So we got to get that right. We can never afford to let ourselves down in that area. And all of those modernizations are late to need. There's another no-fail task, which is the defense internally within Canadian territory. That requires defense capabilities, but not capabilities typically that have big ticket capital investments associated with them. Those are mostly people driven, and we have a pretty good handle on those. So those two areas are kind of like the core area of business that we have to get right as a nation. Now, as a member of the alliance, there is another area of business which is important, and that is the deterrence of Russian aggression along NATO's eastern flank. And that's not strictly speaking a no-fail task for Canada as a nation, but it is a NATO no-fail task. And as a member of NATO, founding member of NATO, we got to be there and be part of that solution. So I'm seeing, they've already started, the government has already started to move to fill in some capability gaps that the war in Ukraine has shone spotlights on in dark corners. So air defense and anti-armor capabilities, for example. And I expect that the update will need to contain some more in that area as well. So I think those are kind of the really important ones from my perspective. There will be a whole bunch of other things. The SSE was big on people, people issues and that sort of thing. And I expect the update will continue that trend. And there are certainly some cultural issues within the military, the people issues and all of that. So they'll be there too, but these are the ones that I'm most focused on.
Speaking of procurement, moving a bit away from SSE and defense policy update, obviously procurement is a bit of a belabored topic here in Canada. As a procurement guy, you're obviously aware that we often in our public discourse criticize procurement, and it seems we've been doing that for a very long time. Having said that, I'm wondering, to your knowledge, are there any specific measures that the government is trying to implement to streamline the procurement process or reduce some of the red tape and ensure the timely delivery of equipment and systems that the CAF needs?
Yeah, so there are a couple of perspectives I'd like to bring in on this. First of all, I think the single most important underlying foundation of the defense procurement issues we see and the chronic state of rust out of key systems is the fact that there's been a long-term strategic imbalance between force structure and defense budget. Basically, we have too much force structure for the budget we're prepared to put into defense. And so too much of the money goes to personnel costs. So, military salaries and benefits and defense civilian salaries and benefits and family programs for military and all that sort of stuff. That's all critical, it's all important. But too much of the budget's going into that. So there's not enough left to progressively and continually recapitalize your equipment and to conduct the training, so the operation and maintenance budget, which allows you to train and keep stuff in good shape. So we need to be consistently spending, in my view, about 25% of the defense budget, whatever that defense budget is, on recapitalization. So that's R&D, test and evaluation, and procurement of equipment. We're not even able to consistently keep up to the NATO recommended floor of 20%. We're scraping along 18, 19, sometimes below that. Australia this year is planning to spend 24% on the recapitalization, and the US spends about 35%. So this imbalance, to me, explains why DND is constantly behind the technology curve and behind the operational effectiveness curve. And it operates its fleets a lot longer than anybody else does. And that creates all kinds of problems in terms of the effectiveness and rust out and the capabilities that the CAF at any given time can bring to any given table. So what we need to do is move ourselves to a state where we are working on long-term plans which keep capabilities current. So, for example, based on a 30 to 35 year planned life cycle for a fighter platform, noting that the CF-18s are now over, the first CF-18s were delivered over 40 years ago, and they're going to continue serving until they're about 50 years old. And all of our other systems are basically in the same boat. So there's a constant competition within DND to figure out which looming obsolescence is the most urgent. That's where the money goes, and everybody else has to wait. So we need to sustain a recapitalization spending level, I say about 25% over a long period of time to get through all, to clean up all of the backlog of problems. And that's regardless of whether we're spending 1% or 2% or 3% of GDP on defense. Pick your number. 25% goes to recapitalization, and then you divvy up the others between what you need for O&M, and you structure the personnel and force structure to what you can afford. If we could do that, if SSE update can do that, it would be the most important defense policy reform in this country since the unification of the armed forces, the integration and unification of the armed forces at the end of the 60s and early 70s. I'm not holding my breath to see that. So to go on to the second part of your question, I wasn't in D&D when SSE itself was drafted, so I don't know what the machinations went on behind the scenes. I was involved with CDA Institute and a number of folks in offering recommendations to the external panel advising the minister on the development of the policy. And I wrote some stuff that I know the panel members had seen in the lead up to that. It was pretty clear to me that there was some active discussion, very active discussion, I expect, among ministers. It was clear that Minister Freeland, as I said earlier, had some pretty activist views in terms of what the global security situation demanded. And I think that at the time, retired Lieutenant General Andy Leslie was in the government. He was the government whip for a while, or the House leader for a while, and he undoubtedly had some input. So there were views there, and they would have been sort of more activist views. Others, I think, probably at that time, including the Prime Minister, maybe less so, but they would have had a very lively debate, and that's good. That's what we want our governments to do. And I think in the end, it was the reality of Russia's belligerence that made SSE surprisingly ambitious compared to what the government seemed to have in mind when it came into power 2 years earlier in 2015. At that time, they hadn't, they still had a more positive view of China and other things, but they were assessing the situation as they saw it at the time. So, and I mentioned now since then, we've had the strategic shock events, and the government's clearly aware that things are turning turtle globally, and we got to be part of the solution. If we're not part of the solution, we're part of the problem. And whether that will, as I said, whether that will translate into a full court press to get us to 2% of GDP or above in terms of defense spending, I doubt. But I kind of think that we'll see some change in the some inflection in the trend lines, maybe a little bit faster, a little bit closer to getting us there instead of in 10 or 15 years. Maybe we get there in 5 to 10 years. I'm not sure. We'll see. It'll be interesting to watch.
Chuck, thanks once again for joining me. It's always a great pleasure having you on the podcast. Thanks so much for making the time, and we'll talk to you again soon. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or you can subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.